Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I wanted to film a dedicated review to the Hermes bronzer. So this is in the shade number 3 Sahara. And if you guys watched my best of 2023 makeup video, you know that this was one of my favorite powder bronzers of the year. And so I did do a previous video with this just as my initial impressions. And so I wanted to do a follow-on video now that I've used this for a while, so I can share with you guys my overall review, demo this product, and also do a ton of comparison swatches. I think I have like 10 to 20 bronzers on my desk right now. So I will do a lot of comparison swatches because at least for me, this was definitely a product where I was very confused about the shade range. And so hopefully this video is helpful for any of you guys who are interested in picking up this formulation. So first off, let me just show you guys the packaging because this is Hermes. This is very expensive. This is the most expensive bronzer I have in my collection. It's like $100, I think. So it has this beautiful brushed brassy gold backing to it. And then on the front, it's white with this cute little medallion. It's not the heaviest packaging, so it's actually quite light, but it still does feel reasonably luxe. Inside you have a sizable mirror, and then you have actually 3 shades in these. So in practice, I usually just kind of use them all together. But if you do want a more curated look, you could technically focus either on this stripe down the middle, which is a little bit deeper, or the lighter toned H, or it's probably hard just to get the sides, but that is also even lighter. For the swatches, I'm going to swatch each of the tones separately and then all together so you guys can see. So we have the deepest tone, which is down the center. It's also very red. And then we have the H, which is a little bit more yellow in undertone, a little bit more moderate. And then we have the outside portion. And it does pain me to disturb the embossment, but hopefully this is useful for you guys. So you can see the outer portion is kind of the lightest shade. And then just to kind of swirl everything together, we have this, which is kind of the intermediate of them. So here you guys can see a close-up. Here is the stripe down the middle, the H, the area kind of just around the sides. This one was the hardest to pick up, and this is the shade sort of swirled together. So first to just talk about the shade a little bit. So you might be kind of surprised given my skin tone, which is on the light medium side, that I picked up the shade 3. I think there's a total of 5 shades. And so normally I would probably go in with the second deepest shade, which is Atlas. And most of the reviews I saw online were for Atlas or the first shade, which is Totori. I picked up Sahara though because a very common theme I saw in all of the reviews of Totori and Atlas was that people didn't really like just how yellowy in undertone those 2 shades were. They were very warm overall. And so my understanding from like the very few reviews I saw of Sahara was that this is much more red in undertone. And personally, that's my preference when it comes to bronzers. I prefer something that is a little bit more neutral, a little bit more leaning red, just because I find on my skin tone that works better for this sort of bronzer look I like to do. Generally, I'm not someone who just puts bronzer kind of on the high points of my face to give myself that really like bronzy, been in the sun goddess look. Instead, I like something that I can sort of use more in the hollows and shadows of my face to give myself a little bit of that bronzy, sun-kissed look, but also to kind of contour my face. I usually can't be bothered to do like a separate contour and bronze. And so as a result, I personally do enjoy these sorts of tones a bit more that have just a little bit more red to them. That said, I was worried when I first picked this up because since it's number 3, I was worried it was just going to be way too pigmented and that I would really struggle to deal with the opacity. But as you guys will see in today's demo, this actually has a very lightweight application, and so you can really build this up to the level of opacity that you want. And before we get into the demo, let me just also share the other details that are available about this bronzer. So I was right, this is $105, and it's described as a bronzing mineral powder inspired by 3 of nature's elements, air, sun, and earth. It's supposed to be ideal for all skin types, and it's supposed to have a veil of finely iridescent pigmented powder on the skin, illuminating it with natural warmth. Now, if you look in the compact very carefully, I'm not sure if the camera will quite pick it up, but there is a tiny bit of iridescence. So you definitely can see really, really small reflective properties. On the face, it doesn't look shiny at all, but it is definitely not a flat matte appearance. This formula is composed of 88% ingredients of natural origin. It helps blur imperfections and unify the complexion while caring for the skin. So it has hyaluronic acid, and the shade Sahara is described as undulations of amber beige caressed by the Saharan wind, highlighting the complexion with sun-kissed hues. And this does have a Hermes perfumey fragrance, so it's a very interesting scent. It definitely smells very luxe. It's not like one of those sort of sweet candy sorts of scents. It has a little bit of muskiness, so it has that more sophisticated air to it. For me personally, I don't really like fragrances in my products. That said, I think for this level of fragrance, it's fine with me. When it's on the skin, I can't smell it at all. It's just in the application process. But did want to call that out in case you are sensitive to fragrance. So now let's get into the demo. So I brought out a bunch of my different bronzer brushes so I can share with you guys how the application looks with different brushes. I'm going to start out with my Face Pro from Sonia G, since this is a really great, just very easygoing brush that leaves a very natural finish. So I'm going to start this on my forehead. And you can see that even though I'm actually wearing like my lightest foundation today, this is actually a little light for my skin, but wintertime is the only time I can even start to pull off this foundation. Even with this super light shade, I'm still able to apply this without it looking too harsh. I'm not being too precious. I'm just kind of dabbing into this, and you can see it still works with this lighter shade. In case you're curious what foundation I'm wearing or any of the other products on my face, I will have those linked in the description box. But you can see that was just very quick and easy, very beautiful natural finish. Let me actually turn down the brightness and bring you guys closer so you can see this a little bit better. I really like that this is not a flat matte finish, but it's also not shimmery. So you can see that where I have this product, it still has that kind of natural glow to the skin. Now to build this up a tad, I'm going in with my Sonia G Fan L. With this brush, I find I can be more targeted. So for example, I can go just down the center if I want to really pick up the darker shade and then concentrate that on the edges. So this is a really nice brush to use with this product if you want to get the individual sections. You can also focus it on the side if I want more of the lighter shades. And I really think the name Plein Air is a great description for this bronzer, because what I love about it is just so light and airy on the skin. You can just keep on applying it. I don't feel like I have to be very precious with this product, which is my preference when it comes to bronzer. I find that I can very easily go overboard if I'm not careful, especially in the winter time when my skin is on the lighter side. But as you can see with this side of my face, I put quite a few layers on, actually a lot more layers than I would typically put on, but it still looks relatively natural compared to this side where I don't have any product on. And then I also really love using this on a smaller brush. This is my Fan A from Sonia G, and putting this on my nose, because I always need to do a little bit of nose contour just so the center of my face doesn't look completely blotted out by the foundation. Side note, I love these new fan face brushes from Sonia G. They're like the perfect shapes for bronzer. But you can see that this just does a pretty good job of providing a little bit more dimension on this half of my face compared to this half. On the other side, I'm going in with my Niji Pro and just kind of taking all of the shades and blending that in. Again, one thing I love about this bronzer is I feel like I can apply it with any of my brushes, which I have a hard time oftentimes with bronzers, and find that part of why I need to buy so many different bronzer brushes is because a lot of my bronzers work really well with certain brushes but don't for others, just depending on how hard pressed they are. And like I said, bronzer is a product I do like to have a bit more control over, just because I do find that it can get really muddy really easily on me. But not with this formula. Pretty much any brush I pick up, whether it be really fluffy like the Face Pro or very targeted like the fan brushes, just does a really good job. And then similar to the other side, I'm going to go in with this brush again just to do a little bit more targeted application. And this is actually perfect on a day like today where I'm wearing a foundation that is a little bit too light for me. So I can just bring in a little bit more of that bronziness to my skin. Finishing off with a bit more on the nose. Alrighty, so here we have the bronzer on the skin. What do you guys think? So just to finish up this look, I'm going to also go in with some blush. This is my Suqqu Pure Color Blush, and I'm going to use my new Hakuhodo brush just to sweep this on the cheeks. I wanted to save blush for last so you guys could just really see the color of the bronzer by itself. This is also a really beautiful blush. Okay, I might have gone a little bit heavy-handed with the blush, so I'm actually going to go in with a little bit more of the bronzer just so the cheeks don't look so purely red. Just to balance everything back out again. Sometimes this happens with me with blush. I just get a little bit too excited about the shade. Alright, so here we have the final look. So now let's get into some comparison swatches. So I have a lot of products out in front of me today. So I'm not going to do this in any particular order, but let's start out with my Chantecaille bronzer in the shade Goa. I do anticipate this will be a lot cooler toned than this Hermes. And yes, you can see that is a bit on the deeper and cooler side. This is also a very different formula. This is more of a gel cream formula, so it almost feels a little bit creamy in the pan, whereas the Hermes is definitely a lot more powdery. I would say the trade-off is this one applies much more pigmented, so you tend to need to buff this out, whereas the Hermes really applies in very lightweight layers. Next, we have my Victoria Beckham bronzer and contour duo. I have this in shade 3. So here is the contour shade, and then here is the bronzer shade. So these actually look kind of similar, I would say. If you sort of blended these two together, you would maybe get something that's kind of like this one. I would say the Hermes is maybe a little bit more yellow in undertone in comparison to this Victoria Beckham. In terms of formulation, the Victoria Beckham, though, is definitely way more pigmented, and so I do think if you have a lighter skin tone, it's probably better to go with the Hermes. I really like this bronzer in the summer months, but in the winter, I find this to be a bit too pigmented on my skin tone. And here we have the Gucci bronzer in shade 2. This was my ride or die for a long time. You can see this one is much more cool toned and rosy in comparison to any of these versions of the Hermes. Overall, a lot more yellow compared to this. This one, similar to the other ones, is definitely more pigmented as well and has a much stronger fragrance. This has a very sweet sort of candy fragrance to it, but still very luxe. I still enjoy this bronzer as well. Then we have my Pat McGrath bronzer. I have this in shade Nude Honey. This was also one of my best bronzers of 2023. This was probably my most used one. I got this way earlier in the year. You can see this shade is overall a lot more neutral in comparison to the Hermes bronzer. It has a little bit more red to it than some of the previous ones, but definitely not as red as the center stripe of the Hermes. For me, this is the perfect, really like more contour-oriented bronzer. I really like this for just any sort of everyday look. It looks very natural on my skin tone. Next, we have the M Cosmetics bronzer in this shade Slip. This is actually very similar to the Pat McGrath, so I consider these to be sort of more or less kind of the same type of shade and formulation. They're both a little bit more on the cool toned contour side instead of the bronzer side. You can see the shades are quite similar. The Pat McGrath just has maybe a little bit more yellow undertone to it. I do like the formulation a little bit more of the Pat McGrath though, so that's overall my preference between those two. Then we have this Bronze and Glow palette from Natasha Denona. So this is a much deeper shade, but does definitely have some of that reddishness. So you can see of all of the shades I've swatched so far, this is probably the most similar to the center shade of the Hermes, although this one is still more warm, I would say, a little bit more yellowy orange in comparison to this one. This one is truly very, very red. I don't get a lot of use out of this one just because I got this in the winter time and it's way too deep for my winter complexion, but I anticipate this to be more useful for me in the summer. Next, we have LYS in shade Harmony. This is their medium skin tone shade. This one is also a little bit deep for me in the winter time, but it's actually a decent match, I would say, for the center of the Hermes. Definitely deeper than the overall mixed together shade. But, yeah, of the ones we've seen so far, I think this one's actually the most similar to the center shade. I do really like this formula. It is very easy to blend out and very easy to use. Again, more pigmented than the Hermes. I think that's going to be kind of a common theme. I guess one thing I should mention with the Hermes is if you do have a deeper skin tone, I do think you're going to spend a lot of time building up this formula. Like, you know, as you saw for me today, I put a lot of layers on and it's still pretty subtle overall. Now for me, I like that because I think it gives me a lot of control and also the shade would otherwise be too deep for me. But I did want to call that out because this is technically the third shade. And so if you are someone who has a medium tan skin tone and you're buying this thinking that this is going to be really pigmented, it is not nearly as pigmented as like pretty much all of the other formulas I'm talking about today. Next up, we have the Glowish powder from Huda Beauty. This is technically not a bronzer, but I have it in shade 5 medium, so I personally enjoy using this as a luminous bronzer. This is quite glowy. It's sort of a finishing powder and quite light compared to a lot of the other ones, though I think tone-wise, this has a similar level of yellow to what you see in the Hermes. In general, it's been interesting to see that even though I picked Sahara because it's less yellow than Atlas and Totori, Sahara is still a bit more yellow than most of the other shades here. But this Huda one does look kind of similar, just lighter. Next, we have this Pite Beauty Duo in the shade Bali. This is 2 shades in one, but I'm just going to kind of mix them together at the center and give you guys one swatch. So this is a bit more of a neutral tone. It's also lighter than the Hermes. And then I also have the contour from the Film Star Bronze and Glow from Charlotte Tilbury. This is definitely the lightest. You can barely see this. It's funny, when I first picked this up, I swatched it and was certain this would not show up on me because as you can see in swatch, it's really, really barely there. I do find though, if you want a very natural looking contour and you have a similar skin tone to me, this does surprisingly work. It's just so cool toned and peachy. It gives you that illusion of a shadow. It's not going to give you any bronziness or anything, but it does actually show up. So before we move on, here is a close-up of those swatches on the first side of my arm. So again, we have the 3 different layers of the Hermes bronzer, starting from the deepest shade down the middle to the H to the outer corners. Here's the Hermes bronzer all swirled together. And then let me see if I can remember this correctly. So then we have the Goa bronzer from Chantecaille. We have the contour and bronze shade from Victoria Beckham. We have the Gucci bronzer in shade 2. We have the Pat McGrath bronzer in Nude Honey, M Cosmetics in Slip, Natasha Denona Bronze and Glow bronzer, LYS bronzer in Harmony, Huda Beauty powder in Medium 5, Then we have the Pite bronzer in Bali and the Charlotte Tilbury Film Star Bronze and Glow contour shade. Now the rest of the bronzers I have are all from Hourglass, so I'm going to do this on the other side of my arm. First, I'm going to go back in and provide a general swatch of the whole Hermes bronzer. So we have that up here as our reference swatch. And then I'm going to start with my Ambient Lighting Sculpture Mini. So in this palette, we have Golden Bronze Light from Hourglass. Swatch that right here. So this is a little bit of a lighter shade. Also a little bit more yellowy warm. I do find this one's a little bit warm for my taste. It also is a bit more luminous in comparison to the Hourglass. I'm not sure if the camera will be able to pick that up, but it definitely shines a lot more. Then we have Lustrous Bronze Light from the Elephant palette. This is also a bronzer that I find to be a little bit warm on me. As you can see, it's quite orangey. It's also quite luminous as well. I do really like the Hourglass formulation though, and find that these apply really beautifully. Next we have the Tiger palette. This has Transcendent Light, which is technically a finishing powder. It's not actually meant to be a bronzer, but you can certainly use it as such. And you can see this one is a lot deeper and also a lot rosier and cool toned. Personally, I find this one a little bit tricky for me to use on my skin tone. Then we have the Owl palette. This is actually the Jellyfish palette, and the bronzer is Lunar Bronze. This is one of my favorite, probably my overall favorite bronzer from Hourglass. You can see this one is a little bit on the lighter, more neutral side. Definitely a lot more neutral than the Hermes bronzer. And then finally, we have the Sculpture palette and the Natural Bronze Light shade. This is like my most used Hourglass bronzer since I've had this palette for the longest. This is also a really beautiful kind of rosy, neutral toned bronze. It is very luminous though. So here again, we have the Hermes bronzer followed by all of the Hourglass bronzers. I would say none of them are super close. Maybe the closest is actually the first one mixed with the Jellyfish one, if those two had a baby. But in general, most of these are a tiny bit lighter and either more yellow or more rose, but don't really have the same sort of kind of terracotta shade to them. And then many of these are much more shimmery as well. And in case it's helpful, here is a final look at all of the swatches with the lights turned down a little bit. Feel free to pause if you want to take a closer look. And here again are the Hourglass swatches. So with all those swatches out of the way, let me just get into my overall thoughts and impressions about this bronzer. So as I said at the top, this was one of my all-time favorite bronzers for 2023. I was really excited to try this out. I spent a lot of time online investigating shades, watching reviews, trying to figure out if this formula was worth it, because as I mentioned, this is the most expensive bronzer in my collection. I have a lot of luxury bronzers, as you guys can see, but most of them are more in like the $50–$60 range, whereas this is over $100. So this was very much a treat myself moment to pick this up, and this is also the one product that I have from the Hermes beauty line. I am very happy though that I picked this up, and I'm very happy that I picked it up in this shade. I think this entire line does definitely run a bit on the yellow warm side just when I look at all of these comparisons, and I'm glad that I picked up one that is slightly more neutral and a little bit more reddish in comparison to the other ones. What is really special about this formula is just how incredibly buildable it is. If you are someone like me who really doesn't like to fuss with your bronzer, who just wants to be able to kind of slap it on, blend it out, not worry about patchiness, not worry about it being too strong, then I think this is a really excellent formula to try out. Now, if you are someone who likes either a much darker bronze, maybe you have a deeper skin tone, or you just want something that will give you a lot of pigmentation with one swipe that you can then buff out instead of building up layer by layer, then I think this is probably not a very good formula for you, because I feel like I've never really built this up to the point where it's like really, really strong on my face. And so even though theoretically I think this is a very buildable formula, it would just kind of take too much time and be too much of a hassle if you were trying to get that level of opacity. And if you do have a deeper skin tone than me, I would recommend kind of going up to 4 or 5, because my understanding from some of the reviews I've watched is the level of pigmentation does kind of ramp up once you get to those shades. So hopefully you don't have to build it up as much. But at least for me, I find this shade to be pretty flattering overall on my skin tone. Now, do you need this bronzer? Definitely not. I would say that there are plenty of other bronzers in my collection that are really lovely and are, you know, around half of this price. So I wouldn't say that this is something that you absolutely must have in your collection, but I do think this is an example where when you're paying for more, you're actually getting something for that. So if you are someone who wants to splurge a little bit, if you like Hermes, if you like this packaging, you will not be disappointed by the formula, I would say. You know, there's certain luxury products where you're really just buying it for the packaging or for the name brand, and the formula is not that different from what you could get for a cheaper price. This is one where I do think there is something special to this formula, at least if you have preferences like me. So consider this a recommend if you are in the mood for a splurge, or if you want someone to get this for you as a gift. So that's it for today's video. I would love to hear in the comments if you guys have tried this product, what you guys think about it, and in general, what your favorite bronzer is. I do have a lot of formulas at this point in my collection, but I'm always interested in hearing what people's favorites are, since at this point, if I'm gonna buy any more bronzers, it better be a really, really good formulation. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks again, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye!